October 15th, 1954, 11:47 p.m. Raymore Drive, North York, Toronto. Jim Crawford stood at his living room window, watching his front lawn disappear. Not gradually, not inch by inch. The grass, the hedge, the maple tree he'd planted 3 springs ago, gone in a matter of seconds, swallowed by a torrent of brown water that moments earlier had been the Humber River, 300 yards to the west. His wife called from the hallway. The basement was flooding. He told her to forget the basement. They needed to leave. Now. He couldn't have known that, within the next 6 minutes, his house would be torn from its foundation, that 5 of his neighbors would drown in their homes, that by morning, 81 people across Toronto would be dead, and the entire city would be forced to confront a truth it had ignored for decades. It had built itself in a floodplain and hoped nature wouldn't notice. Hurricane Hazel noticed. Toronto, in 1954, considered itself immune to disaster. The city had survived 2 world wars, absorbed wave after wave of immigration, transformed from a provincial town into Canada's emerging metropolis. New suburbs sprawled north from the old city core. Developers filled river valleys with bungalows and split levels, advertising riverside living, as though proximity to water was purely aesthetic, a pleasant view rather than a geological hazard. The Humber River was gentle. Everyone knew this. It meandered through West Toronto in a shallow channel, rarely more than a few feet deep, slow-moving, unremarkable. In summer, children waded in it. In winter, it froze solid enough for skating. City planners approved dozens of subdivisions along its banks throughout the late 1940s and early 50s, treating the floodplain as developable land, because it had been decades since the river had done anything noteworthy. The last major flood was 1878. That was 76 years of docility, plenty of time to forget. Metropolitan Toronto's Commissioner of Works, a pragmatic engineer named James Marr, had actually raised concerns about floodplain development in a 1952 report. The document warned that the river valleys, particularly the Humber and the Don, remained vulnerable to extreme weather events. Developers dismissed his analysis as overcautious. The public ignored it entirely. The report gathered dust in a filing cabinet while construction continued. Nature doesn't negotiate with human optimism. Hazel formed as a tropical depression off the coast of Grenada on October 5, 1954. Within 3 days, she'd intensified into a Category 4 hurricane, tearing through Haiti with winds exceeding 125 miles per hour. The death toll in the Caribbean topped 1,000. Most hurricanes weaken rapidly after making landfall, their energy depleted by friction with the earth. Hazel didn't follow the pattern. She moved north, maintaining strength that meteorologists found almost unprecedented for a hurricane traveling so far from warm ocean waters. By October 15th, weather forecasters in Toronto knew something unusual was approaching. But the language of their warnings betrayed their disbelief. Heavy rainfall expected. That was the extent of official concern. Heavy rainfall was manageable. Toronto received heavy rainfall regularly. What arrived wasn't heavy rainfall. It was a collision of meteorological violence. Hazel's remnants merged with an existing storm system over Ontario, creating an atmospheric phenomenon that unleashed rainfall measured not in inches, but in catastrophic volumes. Between 8 p.m. on October 15th and 2 a.m. on October 16th, over 200 millimeters of rain fell on Toronto, more than the city typically received in an entire month, compressed into 6 hours. The Humber River, that gentle, dependable waterway, transformed into a 90-foot wide maelstrom, carrying entire trees, cars, sections of destroyed homes. Water levels rose 30 feet above normal in a matter of hours. The river didn't overflow its banks, it erased them. Raymore Drive ceased to exist that night. 32 homes simply gone. Foundations scoured clean. Residents who'd lived there for years would return to find empty lots where their lives had been. The destruction wasn't limited to one street. Across Toronto, the flooding killed 81 people, left over 4,000 homeless, destroyed more than 1,400 buildings. Emergency responders worked through the night, but the scope overwhelmed them. Telephone lines were down, roads were impassable. In many areas, rescue crews couldn't reach victims until morning, when the water had receded enough to reveal the scale of loss. Dawn broke on October 16th over a city in shock. The Toronto Telegram's front page showed a photograph that would define the disaster. A destroyed bridge over the Humber, its concrete span snapped like kindling. Another image showed a single chimney standing alone in a field of mud. All that remained of a home where a family of 4 had died. The economic damage totaled over $135 million, equivalent to more than $1.5 billion today. But the true cost couldn't be measured in currency. Hurricane Hazel shattered Toronto's faith in its own invulnerability. In the aftermath, Metropolitan Toronto's government faced a choice. They could rebuild exactly as before, treating Hazel as a once-in-a-lifetime anomaly, or they could acknowledge that the city's entire approach to water management was fundamentally broken. James Maher's 1952 report suddenly seemed prophetic. The city convened emergency committees. Engineers submitted analyses. The conclusion was unanimous and damning. Toronto had ignored basic principles of flood control, building in areas that should never have been developed, failing to invest in infrastructure that could manage extreme weather events. The solution required transforming how the city related to its river valleys. Instead of treating them as empty space to be filled with housing, Toronto would need to preserve them as natural corridors, allowing rivers room to expand during floods. This meant purchasing hundreds of properties in floodplains, removing structures, creating permanent green space. But purchasing land and demolishing homes wasn't enough. The city needed active flood control, infrastructure that could protect developed areas from future disasters. In 1955, Metropolitan Toronto made a decision that critics called reckless: the purchase of a Marion 360 power shovel, the largest earth-moving machine ever ordered by a Canadian municipality. The price tag was $50,000. $50,000 in 1955 was staggering for a single piece of equipment. The entire annual budget for Toronto's Public Works Department was $12 million. This one machine consumed nearly 0.5% of that total. City councillors debated the expenditure for weeks. Opposition newspapers ran editorials questioning whether such extravagance was necessary. Critics called it an overreaction to a disaster that might not repeat for another 70 years. The Marion 360 wasn't elegant. It was brutal efficiency incarnated in steel. The machine stood 3 stories tall, weighed 140 tons, and featured a bucket that could scoop 7 cubic yards of earth in a single bite. Its diesel engine generated 360 horsepower, hence the model designation, and could operate continuously for 12 hours before refueling. When it arrived in Toronto by railway in March 1955, crowds gathered to watch it being unloaded. Children stood with their parents, staring at this mechanical monster that seemed impossibly large. Toronto put the machine to work immediately on the most ambitious flood control project in Canadian history. The Marion 360's first major assignment was excavating what would become the G. Ross Lord Dam on the Don River, a massive earthwork structure designed to create a reservoir capable of holding back floodwaters during extreme rainfall events. The work was methodical, relentless. The Marion operated 6 days a week, carving through earth that had lain undisturbed for millennia. its bucket bit into glacial till, ancient clay, bedrock. Each scoop removed tons of material, reshaping geography, one calculated movement at a time. Engineers directed its operator, a man named Frank Kowalski, who'd learned to handle heavy machinery during the war, to dig channels that would allow the Humber to spread laterally during floods, rather than rising vertically and overwhelming its banks. The scale of the transformation became apparent slowly. What had been narrow river corridors widened into broad valleys. Natural bottlenecks were removed. The riverbed itself was deepened in strategic locations, increasing capacity without fundamentally altering the river's character. This wasn't brute force engineering in the mid-century tradition of damming and redirecting. It was more subtle, working with the river's natural tendencies, giving it room to behave as rivers do during extreme weather, but directing that behavior away from human infrastructure. Over the next 15 years, Toronto invested over $80 million in flood control infrastructure. The Marion 360 and machines like it carved out what would become the city's greenbelt system, river valley parks that serve dual purposes as recreational space and flood management corridors. The transformation wasn't just physical. Hurricane Hazel changed how Canadian cities approached urban planning at the most fundamental level. The disaster led directly to the creation of conservation authorities across Ontario, governmental bodies with power to regulate development in watersheds, regardless of municipal boundaries. It established building codes that prohibited construction in 100-year floodplains. It created modern emergency management protocols. The Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, formed in 1957, became one of the most powerful in the province, directly managing the flood control infrastructure that the Marion 360 had carved from the earth. The $50,000 monster became a symbol of transformation, proof that sometimes the appropriate response to disaster isn't incremental adjustment, but fundamental reimagining. Frank Kowalski operated the Marion 360 for 11 years, from 1955 until 1966, when age and the physical demands of the job forced him into retirement. In a 1978 interview, he recalled the early days of the flood control work, the pressure everyone felt to complete the projects quickly before another major storm could test Toronto's still vulnerable defenses. Every time it rained hard, we'd all get nervous, he said, wondering if this was the one, if Hazel was coming back. The machine ran almost constantly those first few years. We'd work late into the evening sometimes, floodlights set up, trying to get another few hundred yards done. People don't realize how much earth we moved. Millions of cubic yards. We reshaped entire valleys. The flood control system was tested multiple times during its construction. Severe storms in 1957, 1960, and 1965 brought heavy rainfall to Toronto, each time raising fears of another Hazel-scale disaster. Each time, the partially completed infrastructure held. Water flowed into the new retention. Ponds, spread into the widened channels, rose to concerning levels, but never breached the defenses. The Marion 360 was sold in 1972, its primary work complete. By then, Toronto's flood control system included dozens of dams, retention ponds, and overflow channels. The G. Ross Lord Dam alone could hold back 88 million cubic meters of water. The flood control infrastructure had prevented an estimated $250 million in damage from storms between 1954 and 1972, 5 times the total investment in the system. Today, most Torontonians walk through the river valley parks without knowing they're traversing engineered flood zones. The trails and green space feel natural, organic, as though the city had always preserved these corridors by choice rather than necessity. Trees planted in the 1960s are now mature forests, Wildlife has returned. Deer, coyotes, countless bird species. The flood control infrastructure has become invisible, integrated so completely into the landscape that it no longer reads as human intervention. But the remnants of that October night in 1954 remain visible to those who know where to look. On Raymore Drive, now a quiet street in a rebuilt neighborhood, a small plaque marks where 32 homes once stood. The text is simple. In memory of those who lost their lives in Hurricane Hazel, October 15, 1954. The Humber River flows past, calm and narrow, its violence contained by the infrastructure that disaster made inevitable. James Crawford survived that night. He and his wife escaped their home minutes before it was destroyed, running through waist-deep water to higher ground. He never rebuilt on Raymore Drive, couldn't bring himself to. He relocated north to higher ground in Thornhill and lived until 1989. In interviews late in life, he spoke about watching his house disappear, about the sound of the water. Not a roar, but something worse, a grinding, comprehensive destruction. He also spoke about the city's response, about how Toronto could have chosen denial, could have rebuilt exactly as before and hoped for better luck. Instead, it acknowledged its vulnerability and adapted. "The storm taught us we weren't as clever as we thought," he said in a 1984 interview, 30 years after Hazel. The machine they bought, that expensive monster everyone complained about, that was the city admitting it had been wrong. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is admit you're not immune to disaster. Toronto did that. Not easily, not cheaply, but it did it. Hurricane Hazel killed 81 people in Toronto. The Marion 360, that $50,000 monster, helped ensure that no storm since has come close to that toll. The machine is gone now, scrapped decades ago, but its work endures in every kilometre of River Valley Park, every retention pond, every widened channel. Toronto's Greenbelt system, praised today as visionary urban planning, was born from disaster and built by a machine most residents never knew existed. The Humber River still flows through Toronto. It rises and falls with rainfall, swells during spring melt, shrinks during summer droughts. But it flows within boundaries now, through corridors that give it room to rage without destroying. On quiet days, it's gentle again, the way it was before Hazel, the way Jim Crawford remembered it from the years he lived on Raymore Drive. The difference is, Toronto no longer mistakes that gentleness for permanence.